adjunct professor of history at Charleston Southern University in the Citadel, and I'm here to talk to you this afternoon about a lost and forgotten piece of history. You see, back in 1978, there were these two brothers, Jimmy and Edward Moore, who were driving in Kingstree, South Carolina, in Williamsburg County, when they came across this abandoned trunk. And they found in the abandoned trunk the papers of a man that was largely forgotten by history, a fellow by the name of Stephen Swales, who is shown here on the cover of this book. And it turns out that they sold the papers to the University of South Carolina, and many years later, a fellow by the name of Gordon C. Rhea went over there to investigate the papers, and with those remaining papers, he wrote the story of Stephen Swales, a black freedom fighter in the Civil War and Reconstruction. And the essence of the story is as follows: that Stephen Swales was born in 1832 in a place called Columbia, Pennsylvania. Even though he was born a free man, although black and free, his family was not spared of troubles. Columbia, Pennsylvania was a hotbed of race riots at the time. Many people felt that the blacks were unfair competition for their jobs, and there were stories about crime and supposedly rapes of white women and all that sort of thing. And so a lot of people were burned out and chased away and harassed out. So after a few years of this, the family moved to several towns. And when Stephen became a young man, the Civil War was going in full swing, and so he enlisted with the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the famous black regiment that you saw in the movie Glory. And they also came down to South Carolina to fight in the battle that was depicted at Fort Wagner, that was over in the movie Glory, that you saw with Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington and so forth. And after being a survivor of that battle, when the war ended, he became an agent for the Freedmen's Bureau in Kingstree, South Carolina, just about 70 so miles north of Charleston. So with this, he took care of cases where freed people were being cheated out of their land and terrorized and so forth. And he eventually became the mayor of Kingstree, South Carolina during that Reconstruction era. Wait, how'd that happen? Well, he was part of that committee down in Charleston in 1868 of 76 blacks and 48 whites who came together after the Civil War to turn the South Carolina Constitution into one of democracy. And after that, South Carolina had two black lieutenant governors. The University of South Carolina was integrated, as well as the South Carolina legislature. And African Americans began to vote and go to school. Unfortunately, that was not to last. The Ku Klux Klan organized in Pulaski, Tennessee, around the same time all of this was happening, and they spread throughout the South, as well as South Carolina. And their rise led to the fall of the Reconstruction era, of all that progress for black people. And once they got into charge, segregation became the laws, and then Reconstruction ended, and African Americans began to be reduced to a permanent class of cheap labor for a very long time. But Stephen Swails continued to stay in office, and he had to fight off a lot of people in the Klan and such who tried to chase him out of office and run him out of town and so forth. He eventually died in 1900, and around that same time, the United Daughters of the Confederacy was trying to take this type of history that I've described to you about Reconstruction out of the schools and replace it with a narrative that claimed that slavery had little to do with the Confederacy. And the stories of the great black leaders of that time were largely buried and forgotten for a very long time, up until recently, when scholars such as Eric Foner and Dr. Henry Louis Gates began to bring them back before the public. And part of that effort is Gordon C. Ray's book, Stephen Swales, Black Freedom Fighter in the Civil War and Reconstruction, which is a very interesting book, and I strongly recommend it. But I have to add this to it. A lot of times people throw out what turns out to be great history. I know of a church, for example, who threw out a trunk full of their papers that dealt with their history, and they asked me to do research, and I said, well, I can't do that because you don't have any papers to go by, and many of the people from that period are now dead. So you have to really look out for things before you throw them out, because some of the things that you throw out may be of real value, and may contain some stories that a young person might read and may want to inspire them to go on and do even greater than the people who are written about in these stories. So retrieve your stories, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very valuable way to inspire the youth of the next generation. And this book is just one example. This is Damon Fordham.